historic numbers have significantly declined in the past 18 years. Our highest run ever was in 2002 in the Central Valley, to where we had over 700,000 fish return to the Sacramento River, Feather River, and American River system. The last few years, we've had about 100,000 fish or less returning. We are seeing a huge rapid decline, and one of the major reasons that is due to hatchery management and HSRG.
I started salmon fishing the American, Feather, and Sacramento Rivers in the mid-70s. In the mid-70s, it was nothing for us as teenagers to go to the American River and catch our legal limit of 2 salmon in 10 to 15 minutes. When you hear stories of people being able to walk across the water in salmon, it was true. There were literally hundreds of thousands of salmon in the American, as well as the Feather and Sacramento River. In 2002, we had over 700,000 returning salmon in the Central Valley. In 2017, we had under 100,000 returning salmon in the Central Valley. We attribute the declining numbers to 2 major factors. 1, the diversion of water out of the Sacramento Valley and Delta. And 2, the implementation of HSRG.
A salmon redd, also known as a nest, is where salmon come back and pair up and actually fan an area in the gravel to lay their progeny and lay the eggs to fertilize them so that they can emerge from the gravel for the next generation. One of the largest concerns of water management in the Central Valley is something that's called red dewatering. Red dewatering is where the flows are a certain height and elevation on the river. For example, on the Sacramento River of about 6,500 CFS, to where the salmon come in to start spawning up on the edges of the actual river. And then the Bureau of Reclamation will then lower the water, which leaves the redds high and dry.
Mitigation replaces or attempts to replace the numbers of fish that would normally have naturally spawned in that environment that can no longer do so.
HSRG is Hatchery Review Science Group. It was a group of scientists with a theory on how hatchery fish and wild fish should intermingle. It started in the early 2000s. It was officially adopted by the state of Washington in 2008, I believe. It was to strengthen genetic purity. At that time, they thought hatchery fish and wild fish couldn't coexist on the spawning beds. So basically, it was a plan to make sure hatchery fish and wild fish didn't compete against one another. HSRG has had a great negative effect on hatchery production. The scientific theory has not worked at all. We have 4 or 5 generations of fish under HSRG. It hasn't improved. In fact, it's got a lot worse. I can't think of one prime example where it has worked. Since the HSRG scientific theory group came out, there's been new science that showed hatchery fish and wild fish can exist, because in Washington, for the most part, our wild fish and hatchery fish have been intermingling since the early 50s. And you know, the genetics are exactly the same.
The natural spawn is what produces. The Feather River is kind of the mothership of the whole Central Valley. More fish make it through here than any other system. I mean, you've got a little system on the Sac for Battle Creek, but again, that's Battle Creek. You know, that's not the Sacramento River. That's a whole issue within itself.
7286. 7286. Chop.
When I grew up fishing and I started my career here in '95, but I've been fishing it since '85. And this riffle here, we're in beginning of December for the salmon. Now this whole section's been all closed off for salmon all year long. These riffles used to be absolutely full of salmon, completely packed, every one. Now we've seen a couple salmon in here already. The carcass, there's one in there, right there. But no, I mean full, I mean like hitting your legs, like thousands of them in every riffle for our natural spawners. What's happened, that's been taken away. Been taken away by the amount of fish that go up to the hatchery and that are taken out for the Clean Water Act, the fish that are shipped out of state. So all of a sudden these fish that used to be able to spawn in here aren't anymore. It's affecting the commercial guys in the ocean. It's affecting the river guys. It's affecting the Sacramento River. And the fish that are being killed and shipped off, we don't even know if they're true feather fish or sac fish. Some are hatchery fish, some are natural spawn fish. No one knows, they're just killing them and shipping them off. I'm not talking about a few fish. I'm talking already this year, over 30,000 king salmon have been killed and shipped out to Washington. This is unspawned fish. This is all documented, this is all fact. So when you come down to a riffle like this, I'm in my mid 40s, and I see this riffle here, like I said, we've seen a few, but normally we would see 500 tails of fish all spawning in here. That helps the whole system, the whole ecosystem. Taking out 30, 40,000 king salmon out of the system every year doesn't let the natural spawning babies have enough food.
One of the concerns among sportsmen and biologists like myself is that we're going to continue to study and fund and have all the greatest ideas in the world, but none of those ideas are going to be implemented. And if we can't begin to implement more meaningful programs to either naturally or artificially in hatcheries produce more fish in our systems, we're going to see salmon populations decline and potentially collapse in the state of California.
We're on the low flow of the Feather River, and for the guys that have fished with me for the last 25 years, know this is where I started at. But on that other bank, right on the other side, when I was 12 years old, I caught my very first salmon. It was 22 pounds, and I caught it on a Castmaster, legal. The fish bit it, and that was the first one, and it got me hooked, and that's what we want. We want the younger generation to get hooked on fishing, and we want them to love it. The fish counters are counting, they said they've caught over 30,000 fish this year. There's been over 30,000 kings, you guys. That's in the river. 30,000 kings have been shipped off, killed out of the hatchery. That's 60,000 fish that could have naturally spawned in the river.
So today we're up here at the end of the line for salmon on the Feather River. As they come through the low flow channel and get all the way to the town of Oroville, they stop and they hit this barrier dam behind me, and they make a hard left-hand turn into the hatchery. And then that hatchery ladder goes for almost a mile, I believe, if not more, all the way across the street into the hatchery. After we've reached the fish that we need, which is approximately about 4,000 spawning pairs of fish, we need to shut that hatchery door because those fish would actually spawn naturally in the low flow channel. HSRG has said that hatchery fish are inferior, and so they have started reducing the amount of production at these hatcheries and actually turning this hatchery from a production hatchery for spring run into a conservation hatchery because of HSRG.
After the mitigation numbers are met, when they've gotten enough salmon to reproduce them, rather than letting the remaining fish stay in the rivers and spawn naturally and die naturally, the practice has been that all fish need to be removed from the rivers and disposed of. And since the implementation of that practice, you can see the populations have gone down, not only of the salmon, but of the birds, of the various other wildlife that rely on salmon carcasses. So these practices, I think, need to have a critical reevaluation and perhaps changes as quickly as possible.
This section of river from here up is premier spawning ground for wild king salmon. The gravel is perfect, the water depth is just right, the temperature's correct this time of year. We just aren't allowing our fish to do what they're naturally meant to do, which is spawn naturally. Instead, it seems they're taking them and selling them for profit or giving them away. They're just not giving nature a chance. And it's horrible. It's really horrible. And we are seeing terrible declines in a natural spawning system which can support it. It has for 45, 50 years since the dams were put in place. Some of these sections along this river are, like I say, ideal for natural spawning fish, if we would allow them to do so.
Coleman's been here now 77 years, so you could easily say that for 100 years there's been fish propagation going on in Battle Creek, Sacramento River. At Coleman National Fish Hatchery, the purpose is we're a mitigation fish hatchery. We started in 1942 with the creation of Shasta Dam. At that time, the service found this location here on Battle Creek, had cool water temperature, and so we raised fish to mitigate for the impacts of Shasta Dam on the salmon populations in the Sacramento River. Typically, I try to keep track and try to only allow 10,000 fish to enter the adult pond to collect. I try to pulse the ladder, meaning I open and close it as I need it, keeping other salmon outside into Battle Creek, hoping to encourage them to spawn naturally out in Battle Creek, and so we try to target 20,000. This year was pretty good. Our estimate somewhere between 35 and 40,000. We're still kind of rounding up all the numbers. It looks like the hatchery took about 14,000 fish in, and we left probably about 20 to 23,000 out in Battle Creek. So I think it was a pretty good year this year.
This tributary is the tributary that I grew up on, and this used to be a very robust salmon spawning creek, and the habitat in here was just phenomenal. Now, with the problems that we have with the water, you can see it has pulled the water from this normal, what we would call the normal high water mark, down to this level that we're at now, which has actually exposed a lot of gravel down below us. And this would be suitable habitat right below us where the creek comes in. I mean, that would all be suitable habitat for spawning.
I think letting the fish spawn that come to the hatchery, let those fish that would otherwise be disposed of at the hatchery, let them do their thing in the river. That would have a positive effect on the fishery. You know, more is more. You know, more fish is better. Let those fish spawn. That's a step in a positive direction.
What we do see here is the lack of fish spawning. I mean, we should see fish, trying to beach themselves and in the process of the food chain where the salmon spawn and die. We should see carcasses on the shoreline here, vultures coming in to eat the carcasses, big bug hatches over here against the edges of the river. We don't see that.
We need to have sufficient water during the critical times for spawning and for migration, and we need to have enough mitigation numbers being produced at the hatchery to sustain a sport fishery, recreational fishery, commercial fishery, and meet mitigation goals. There's all these different elements that play a factor, but letting those fish that are coming to the hatchery and wouldn't otherwise be spawned or used, letting them spawn in the river would be a great positive step in the right direction. It'd be great for the trout, be great for the steelhead, be great for everything in the river that benefits from salmon being in the water.
So the Yuba River was closed to salmon fishing by the Department of Fish and Game about 20-ish years ago. And since then, we haven't been able to fish here, obviously. And I've really not seen any improvements. The runs have been going downhill. And I really don't know that there's been anything done to improve the fishery here. So back when we were salmon fishing here a couple decades ago, the fishing was phenomenal. I mean, these pools were stacked with kings. All the riffles had tons of spawners on them, and it was like Alaska. We called it Little Alaska. That was kind of our little inside joke. We're heading up to Little Alaska. So it's quite different now. As you'll see, there's very few fish. I think last year, 2018, I read that we had a record low return here, and it's just been on a downward trend for years and years and years.
The Yuba River is the largest tributary off of the Feather River and used to provide angling opportunity for salmon fishermen and steelhead fishermen for years. There are hardly any salmon left on this river, and the fish that actually are here are predominantly strays from the hatchery on the Feather River.
We used to see a lot more salmon in the tailouts. It's full of reds, a lot of spawners, and as the years progress, man, it seems like less and less and less.
So we're here in downtown Sacramento today, a little bit of a different location from what you've been seeing out on the rivers or the hatcheries. But this is probably just as important as what you look at when you're in the Delta or on the inland river system. This is where decisions are made. This is where elected officials from across the state of California get together to pass laws that then turn into regulations that drive the way we manage our hatcheries. If we are not here as advocates for what we believe is right and the solutions we think which will generate positive returns in our fisheries, then we're losing the battle.
One of the challenges for California and West Coast fisheries in general is that the bureaucratic process has become so cumbersome and so laborious that even a lot of the agencies that are responsible for implementing these projects are hamstrung with regulations to the point where we can't get projects done.
So for me, I spend some years over 300 days on the water. I see things that maybe some of the biologists maybe don't see. Maybe they're only here once or twice a month, you know? So for me, why is my information not used? Why can't the biologist and the fishermen and the guides come together, use street smarts with science, and produce more fish?
I mean, this looks good. They did a nice job with it, but I mean, there's like 50 salmon in here, you know?
Yeah, for as close to the hatchery as this is, it should be teeming with salmon right now.
It should be black.
It should be black.
And yeah, nothing wrong with this. Although the downside is one, high water, and this whole thing could wash out like the one at El Manto, and
a few other places on the river that we've seen high water take out the spawning areas.
I mean, this is cool for sure, but it should be just wall to wall.
Yeah.
In the United States, the economic value of outdoor recreation is 2.2% of the United States GDP. That's larger than many other industry sectors, including mining, agriculture, and many others. Here in the state of California, we have nearly 1.8 million anglers and hunters. And collectively, they generate $3.5 billion annually for the California economy and support over 55,000 jobs in a variety of different capacities.
So the Department of Fish and Wildlife has claimed that they don't want these hatchery fish spawning. They say it's not a good thing for the river. But if we didn't have these fish spawning, we wouldn't have any fish at all. These are important to our river systems. They spawn, it's a life cycle. They go through, they die, they replenish the whole ecosystem. something that we need in the river. We don't need all these fish to go up into the hatchery and to be killed and shipped off to another state for other purposes. We need these fish spawning right here in the river. This is what the whole salmon life cycle is about. We need to keep them here. This is not what a healthy river should look like right now for spawning fish. These spawning fish should be everywhere.
Hi, I'm James Stone with NorCal Guides and Sportsmen's Association. We're up here at American Canadian Fisheries in Bellingham, Washington. We're asking questions about all the hatchery fish that they bring in. They said this year in 2019 they brought in over 1 million pounds of fish from California, Oregon, and Washington. But they're not wasted. The fish are right here for sale. $8.99 a pound for pale orange meat, not high quality, but the middle of the road. You can get it all right here, or you can actually buy the lower quality fish right here. $3 a pound for our fish right here. No adipose fin. That's a clipped hatchery fish right here from the Feather River. And come to find that we found our California hatchery salmon eggs here for sale for $5 a piece, or you could buy blocks of them for 20 bucks frozen. But these are our California salmon eggs right here for sale. All of our salmon get pulled out of the hatcheries because of HSRG. Those fish are not wasted. They're brought up here and sold for profit. And this money doesn't go to the state, it stays here up here at American Canadian Fisheries, but you can find all of our fish products right here from our hatcheries.
I started guiding this river in 1998 and been fishing it my whole life prior to that. And from a guiding standpoint, on a personal level, what's really changed for me is I used to be able to make a living here for 4 or 5 months of salmon fishing. And that has so changed in the last 10, 15 years, where now I think I spent 5 days on this river this year. It's just, the runs have gone down so bad, so far, so quickly that it's a shame. It makes me sad almost to be out here to think about how things used to be. And to think that, those historically huge runs of the early 2000s, we're not talking back in 1948 or in the 1920s. This is the past that I can recall and I was a part of. It's not that long ago. And the only thing I can see that's really made a huge difference is policy change. We do have some climate issues and population and all that kind of stuff, but the policy changes are what really have changed this river. We've reduced the amount of fish we release from the hatcheries. We're trying to go away from the hatcheries almost entirely, it seems.
But I think ultimately the number one factor has been the change in the department's policy on how they manage this fishery.
From the depths of the Pacific, the salmon swim in by the millions, led by some strange instinct to the freshwater streams that gave them birth. Once there, they never eat again. Time and birth and death are closing in now. Using only the energy stored in their bodies when they left the ocean, the salmon must ascend the streams that carried them so readily to sea when they were young.
So that salmon that made it back, he's missing an adipose fin, but he went all the way out, spent all those years at sea, came back, spawned in the gravel, and you're telling me he's not fit? I mean, come on. That guy's a survivor. That's exactly what we're looking for. We've weeded out the ones that were inferior. They didn't make it. This guy made it back, and you're telling me he's not worth anything. Well, tell that to fishermen. Tell that. Do you think a killer whale cares if a fish has an adipose fin or not on it? Do you think a sea lion cares if he eats one with an adipose fin or not? No. Do you think the nutrients that come out of that dead fish in the river, do you think the trees, the birds, the baby fish, everything that eats that stuff and lives off, thrives off that nutrient explosion when those fish die, do you think any of that matters? Anybody cares about that? No. We just need a live fish as a good fish in the river, and that's what we need.
Commercial salmon fishermen in California rely on hatcheries every time they go out fishing. Without a functional hatchery system mitigating for the extraordinary damage that we've done to our rivers, we don't have a business. We don't have fisheries. We don't have coastal communities. It's been an extraordinary decline in California commercial fisheries from as recently as the mid-80s. There were 4,500 boats harvesting salmon in California. Today, in a good year, you might have 450. So we've lost about 90% of our strength over my lifetime. That's been done on our watch. It's been done on the watch of the people who are currently in power and their immediate predecessors. And it's because they've let the rivers be sucked dry, and we have not produced enough fish to compensate for that damage.
Man, this is how it's supposed to be right here. So many fish spawn in one little area. This is how the whole river used to look, all the way down to almost top to bottom. It's so cool to see. What's interesting to see here is an awful lot of fish spawning in the riffles here naturally that are missing adipose fins, which to me suggests that they just finding their way home, and they know what they're doing. They don't look inferior to me. It only take about 5 seconds looking at all these fish spawning and seeing how many hatchery fish minus their adipose fins are spawning. And of course we only clip 25% here in California, so the number's probably more than I can tell. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a fish biologist to see that there can't be any true genetically pure wild fish left with all this commingling and interbreeding.
Without mitigation on the rivers where the salmon can no longer spawn naturally, there's not enough viable habitat to produce viable populations, and likely the salmon in those systems, if mitigation stopped, would disappear fairly rapidly.
Behind me is Georgiana Slough, and it is a slough that cuts off the main Sacramento River, which is right behind me here. Water goes this way out into the central delta, the San Joaquin side. And so what happens is, as salmon and steelhead are migrating down the Sacramento River, up to 65% of them get sucked down into this slough and entrained out in the central delta, which is very low velocity, warm water, full of predators, and we suffer huge losses of juvenile salmonids going that way.
To make it very simple, you have this large forebay, or the forebay is like a huge lake, and there are pumps. And the entrance to the forebay is not screened. In other words, it's open. So if you think of a circle that has, part of the end of the circle open, and these pumps are drawing in fish, there are several problems with the pumps. First of all, they draw the fish in to the forebay, and once they're in the forebay, they are subjected to the louvers and the pumps, and millions of fish over decades have been documented of striped bass, steelhead, salmon, delta smelt, all being destroyed by the pumps. The collapse and the demise of the fisheries can be traced to when the switches were turned on in these pumps.
I'm John McManus. I'm with the Golden State Salmon Association. I want to say something about hatchery fish here in California. During the drought, we lost whatever natural spawners they were basically throughout the Central Valley. Right now, we rely on the hatchery fish not only to supply the salmon industry, the fishery, both out in the ocean and in the rivers, but also to recolonize the natural areas in the Central Valley that were basically hurt badly during the last drought.
On the entire West Coast, we're starting to see many different similarities with salmon and steelhead populations that are being affected by overall mismanagement, a lot of people would say. And the people that it's really hurting are guides like myself and communities in small rural America that depend on these fish coming back every single year. And the last 20 years, we're just not seeing the fish come back. We're seeing a downward spiral in all of our fisheries across the entire West Coast, especially here in the Central Valley of California. And if we don't take a different approach and use a different form of management, we're just not going to have them anymore. They're going to be gone.
We do not have a healthy system. This system is not going to be there for our kids or their kids. It's changed that much in a short time, and it's sad.
My father, again, started in 1973. Him and a couple other guys were the only guys that ran along this Sacramento Valley and started kind of the sport fishing industry inland. If he'd have known what they're doing today's practices of removing these fish from the system when they could be there, it would just absolutely break his heart.
If my grandfather saw what they were doing today, I can't say it on camera, boy, I mean, it would be it would definitely, it'd break his heart, honestly. He just loved to fish so much, and he didn't necessarily need the money, but he guided because he loved to fish. and it was a way of life for him.
I want to get back to the point to where you can come out here and catch 3 to 6 fish in a couple hours instead of hoping you get one.
If they don't do something soon, you could literally see this fisheries just go into a sustainable fisheries, where they're just raising enough to keep them alive.
We need to get back to raising the fish to get the numbers back up.
So we've been taking stocks from basin to basin to basin. So our stocks are mixed. So all these stocks originated from wild fish, and now we have hatchery fish. Orca whale doesn't know the difference between a hatchery or a wild fish. It's just ludicrous. I mean, to think that an orca whale is going to pick a wild fish over a hatchery chinook. I mean,
the southern resident killer whales have 3 distinct pods, the JK and L pod, which reside inside the Puget Sound in Washington state. However, those animals are frequently having to leave and travel along the coastline as far south as Monterey, California, every few years in search for Chinook salmon. Chinook primarily is about 85% of their diet, if not more at times. And we're seeing them starve because there's not enough abundance of Chinook salmon off the west coast. There's only one way to completely help the southern resident killer whales, and that is to raise more fish.
So one of the things that people forget about is that we've been propagating salmon populations in the Central Valley for over 100 years. And one of the parts of those programs is that we have moved fish between basins, between hatcheries, and throughout the state of California. The reality of it is that there's a considerable amount of interbasin blending and genetics within the Central Valley. And if we get too caught up on the specific genetics of a specific stream or population, what we're gonna do is kind of lose the ability to look at the salmon populations in the Central Valley as a whole and look at recovery of those populations as a whole.
I wanted to come and work here at this place because my dad started here in 1968, and they started the hatchery actually on the gravel bar of one of the creeks, and then the Forest Service had this facility and they took over here in 1970. We selective spawn, and no one else does that. We big females, big males, and it's just repetitive. That's what we do. We'll put some small ones in the tank just in case we have to use them, but generally we're looking for the bigger fish. We got a good handling process. Some fish probably get stressed, but not a lot of them do. We don't have a high mortality on our fish. So just mainly we're looking for bigger fish. That's all we do is big fish make big fish is pretty much what we understand. I mean, it's proven on this system anyway. There's a lot of competition on the river. There's a lot of gill nets. There's a lot of sport fishermen. We still get those fish in the high 20s. So it's working. So we're going to continue to do it. Our fish, like today, we spawn. Most of those fish will probably go out the door. Someone will come and take them. They'll smoke them. Elders, that's usually what we do with those fish. The ones that die, or the ones that someone's not going to take, we'll take them down and throw them in one of the creeks downriver, so that the animals can feed them. The nutrients will go back in the river. But other than that, no, we don't. Those fish stay out there, and if they spawn, they spawn. There's nothing wrong with hatchery fish spawning. That's the truth. We've got it in Salmon River too. If you've never been to Salmon River, lots of fish there. Cook Creek, there's a hatchery on Cook Creek, and there's a hatchery on Salmon River, plugged with fish. And there's nothing wrong with it. There just isn't. All you gotta do is come fish this river and you'll see, I mean, that's the one thing is people come from all over just to fish here. And that should be proof enough.
The overall trend in my lifetime is definitely a decline because growing up when I first started running the business, I got my captain's license the year before the closure. And, you know, when I was growing up, being a fisherman was a job to have. And now that I'm growing up and my son's coming up in the world, I'm nervous about his future in the industry if he wants to take over.
NorCal Guides and Sportsmen's Association's solution number one is to raise more fish. The second most important solution is to close the hatchery doors. The most mismanagement feature of this video is that we continue to leave the hatchery doors open, fill our ladders full of fish, and then euthanize them, unspawned, and then gift them away to people out of state who then in turn sell those fish for profit. We want these fish to spawn naturally in the rivers, and they will. You just have to let them. And the third most important solution for the state of California and the Central Valley is to be involved with water discussion. We fail in that manner. We've politicized water and salmon so much that people don't want to talk about it. Our government has put our own communities against each other, putting farmers against fishermen and putting other interests against each other, when we should all be working together on a common goal. Fish need water, but they only mainly need water at certain stages of their life cycle. They need water to get out to sea and survive. And then they need water to protect their redds when they're making their nest and spawning naturally. If we could simply fix those two things with our water issues, we would have a lot more salmon.